A scream tore through the dark before Elena Hartley even knew she was awake. Her own heart was pounding so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. She sat up in a bed that still smelled of sawdust and fresh paint, gripping the blanket in both fists, staring into a blackness so complete it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Somewhere outside, close, too close, something had made a sound that was not the wind, and was not an owl, and was not anything she had a name for. She had lived in this cabin for exactly 3 days. For a long moment, she did not move. She counted her own breaths the way a counselor had once taught her, in for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, and slowly, the hammering in her chest began to slow. Moonlight leaked through a gap in the curtains, laying a thin silver line across the wooden floor. She followed that line with her eyes until it reached the door, and only then did she let herself breathe normally again. This was supposed to be the fresh start. This was supposed to be the place where the noise in her head finally went quiet. 6 months earlier, Elena had been sitting in a lawyer's office in Denver, signing papers that ended a marriage she had once believed would last forever. The pen had felt heavier than it should have. Across the table, her soon-to-be former husband would not meet her eyes, and the lawyer kept clearing his throat the way people do when they want a moment to be over faster than it is. When it was finally done, Elena walked out into a parking lot full of cars that all looked the same, sat behind the wheel of her own, and cried until her chest hurt. She had built a life around being useful to other people, a career in logistics that ate her evenings and weekends, a marriage that quietly hollowed itself out while she was busy solving other people's problems, friends who meant well, but who did not know what to say once the ring came off. By the time the divorce was finalized, Elena had realized something that frightened her more than being alone. She did not know who she was when nobody needed anything from her. So she made a decision that surprised everyone who knew her, including herself. She sold the townhouse. She quit the job that had quietly been eating her alive for a decade. She took the money that was left after the lawyers and the movers and the endless small costs of ending one life, and she bought a cabin at the edge of a national forest in Montana, a place she had never even visited before the listing appeared on her screen one sleepless night. The photographs online had shown a modest 2-story cabin with a stone chimney, tall pine trees pressing close on every side, and a small porch that looked out over a valley that seemed to stretch on forever. The listing had called it a fixer-upper with character. Elena had called it exactly what she needed. Her sister Claire had tried to talk her out of it over the phone. "You don't know anyone there," Claire had said. "You've never even changed a tire by yourself. What happens if something goes wrong, and you're an hour from the nearest hospital?" "Then I'll learn how to change a tire," Elena had answered, and something in her voice must have told Claire that the conversation was already over, because her sister had sighed and said only one more thing before hanging up. "Just be careful. Please." Elena had promised she would be. The drive out to Montana had taken 3 days, and with every mile the world outside her windshield had grown wilder and quieter. Somewhere around the Wyoming border, she had turned off the radio because the static kept swallowing every station, and she had driven the rest of the way with only the hum of the tires and her own thoughts for company. It should have felt lonely. Instead, it had felt like exhaling after holding her breath for years. The town nearest her new home was called Merrow Creek, a collection of maybe 400 people, one gas station, one general store that also served as the post office, and a diner that closed at 7 every evening except Fridays. The cabin itself sat another 40 minutes past the edge of town, down a gravel road that curved and climbed through dense forest until the trees finally opened up and revealed the little house waiting at the end of it, exactly as promised, chimney and all. She had stood in the driveway on her first afternoon there, keys still warm in her hand, and looked up at the wall of dark green pines that surrounded the property on 3 sides. The silence had been enormous. Not empty, she would realize later, but full of sounds she simply did not know how to identify yet. Wind moving through branches in a way that sounded almost like breathing. Birds calling to each other across distances that seemed impossible. Somewhere far off, a sound that might have been a large branch cracking under its own weight. Her realtor, a cheerful older woman named Patricia, who had grown up in Merrow Creek and never left, had walked her through the cabin room by room, apologizing for the water stain on the kitchen ceiling and the door that stuck in humid weather, cheerfully pointing out the good bones of the place, the solid oak floors, the stone fireplace that still worked perfectly, the wide windows that let in more light than Elena had seen in her Denver apartment in years. "You'll want to get to know your neighbors," Patricia had said as she handed over the keys. "Not that you have many close by. The Doyle place is about 6 miles that way, and old Walters lived out here longer than anyone. Good man to know if you ever need help. And Daniel Cole, he's the forest ranger for this whole stretch. He checks in on the cabins out this way now and then, especially in winter." Elena had nodded, only half listening, too busy soaking in the fact that this house, this land, this silence, all belonged to her now. That first night had passed without incident, if she did not count the strange dreams that came with sleeping in an unfamiliar bed. The second night had been quiet as well, aside from the wind picking up around midnight and rattling a loose shutter she made a mental note to fix. It was the third night that had brought the sound that woke her with a scream still caught in her throat. Now, sitting upright in the dark with her heart finally slowing, Elena forced herself to think clearly. The sound had not repeated. Whatever it was, it had passed, or moved on, or perhaps it had never been as close as it sounded. Sound traveled strangely out here, she was learning, bouncing off rock and funneling down through the valley in ways that made distant things sound near, and near things sound distant. She lay back down, but sleep did not come easily. Every creak of the old wood beneath her, every gust of wind against the windows, made her body tense before her mind could remind her that she was safe, that the door was locked, that this was simply what it sounded like to live somewhere alive, rather than somewhere paved over. By the time gray morning light finally softened the darkness outside her window, Elena had slept perhaps 3 total hours. She made coffee in a kitchen still half unpacked, cardboard boxes stacked against one wall, and carried her mug out onto the porch to watch the mist lift slowly off the valley below. Deer moved at the tree line, unhurried, unafraid, and for a moment, the fear of the night before felt almost silly. This was the trade she had made: quiet for convenience, space for company, wild, unpredictable beauty for the predictable comfort of city streets, and neighbors close enough to hear through the walls. She had chosen this. She reminded herself of that fact several times over the following days, especially in the evenings, when the sun dropped behind the ridge earlier than she expected, and the darkness that followed felt thicker than any darkness she had known in Denver. She spent her days unpacking, learning the quirks of the old cabin, driving into Marrow Creek for supplies, and introducing herself to the handful of people who ran the general store and the diner. The woman behind the diner counter, a warm, weathered woman named Ruth, took an immediate liking to her, and made sure to tell her which trails were safe for a beginner and which ones tended to flood in the spring. "You're the one who bought the old Kessler place, aren't you?" Ruth had said, refilling Elena's coffee without being asked. "Brave thing, moving out there alone. Most folks who buy that cabin do it as a second home. You planning to stay through winter?" "I'm planning to stay, period," Elena had answered, and something about saying it out loud had made it feel more true. Ruth had studied her for a moment, the kind of look that seemed to weigh a person honestly, and then nodded slowly. "Well, if you need anything, you come find me. And keep your porch light on at night. Not because of anything dangerous, mind you. Just so you can see what's moving around out there. Curiosity's easier to handle than surprise." Elena had laughed at the time, thinking it was simply friendly small-town advice. She would remember those words again, later, with far more weight than she gave them that afternoon. The days settled into a rhythm. Mornings on the porch with coffee, watching mist rise off the valley. Afternoons spent painting rooms, fixing the shutter, learning to split kindling for the fireplace with an axe she had bought at the general store, and a set of instructions she found online. Evenings spent reading by firelight, because the internet connection out here was weak at best, and something about candlelight and old paperbacks felt right in a house this old. It was on the 4th night that everything changed. Elena had gone to bed a little after 10, exhausted from a day spent hauling boxes and hanging curtains, and had fallen asleep faster than she had any night since arriving. She did not know what woke her, not immediately. There was no scream this time, no crash, no sound sharp enough to shock her upright. Instead, there was a small, thin, broken sound, so faint she almost convinced herself she had dreamed it. She lay still, listening, and there it was again, a whimper, soft, wet, pained, coming from somewhere close, somewhere inside the room. Every instinct told her it was a mouse, or perhaps a raccoon that had found its way in through some gap she had not yet discovered and sealed. She had heard stories from Patricia about the wildlife that occasionally wandered into these old cabins, looking for warmth or an easy meal. A raccoon would be an inconvenience, a mouse would be nothing at all. Still, her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the flashlight she had started keeping on her nightstand, a small concession to the fear that still lingered from her first night here. She switched it on and swung the beam slowly across the floor, half expecting to see nothing, half hoping to see nothing, because whatever was making that sound was clearly hurt, and hurt animals were unpredictable. The whimper came again, closer now, definitely from beneath the bed. Elena's breath caught. She hesitated for a long moment, flashlight trembling in her grip, torn between the very reasonable instinct to simply leave the room and call someone in the morning, and a different instinct entirely, one she could not quite name, that told her something in that sound needed help right now, not tomorrow. She lowered herself slowly to the floor, knees against old wood, and angled the flashlight beneath the bed frame. Two eyes caught the light and reflected it back at her, amber and glassy and wide with fear. Elena's first thought was that she was looking at a dog, some lost hiking companion that had wandered off a trail and found its way to her porch and then, somehow, inside. But even as the thought formed, something about the shape beneath the bed told her otherwise. The proportions were wrong for a dog. The ears were too large for the narrow, delicate skull. The legs, visible now as the creature shifted weakly away from the light, were long and rangy in a way that no house pets ever were. It was small. Impossibly small, no bigger than a house cat. Its gray and brown fur matted with something dark that Elena's stomach recognized before her mind fully processed it. One side of its body looked scraped raw, the fur torn away in a patch that made her wince just looking at it. Its breathing was fast and shallow, each small chest rise looking like an effort. It was a wolf pup. Elena was almost certain of that even before some distant part of her memory supplied the word. Young, injured, terrified, and hiding beneath the bed of a woman it had never met, in a house it had somehow found its way into, on the fourth night of a new life that Elena had chosen precisely because it promised peace. The pup let out another thin whimper, and this time it did not pull further away from the light. It simply lay there, watching her with those wide amber eyes, too weak or too frightened to do anything else. Elena stayed frozen on the floor for a long moment, flashlight beam steady on the small, broken shape in front of her, her own heart hammering with a fear that had nothing to do with the strange sounds of her first night here, and everything to do with the very real, very fragile life, trembling 6 inches from her outstretched hand. She had come to this cabin looking for quiet, looking for a place to rebuild herself, slowly, without anyone depending on her for anything. She had not expected, on her 4th night, to find something that depended on her completely, something small and wild and dying, hidden beneath her own bed, waiting for a stranger to decide whether it lived or not. Elena Hartley did not know it yet, but the life she had planned for herself in this cabin was about to change into something she never could have imagined, something that would test every ounce of patience and courage she had left after the year that had already broken her down and built her back up again. All she knew, in that first frozen moment on the cold wooden floor, was that whatever this small creature was, it needed her, and for the first time since her marriage had ended, someone, or something, needed her again. Slowly, carefully, she set the flashlight down so its beam still illuminated the space beneath the bed without shining directly into the pup's eyes, and she began to speak in the softest voice she could manage, the kind of voice she might have used on a frightened child, though she had never had one of her own. "It's okay," she whispered. "I'm not going to hurt you. I promise." The pup did not move, did not relax, but it did not try to flee either, and something about that stillness, that fragile, exhausted trust or perhaps simple surrender, settled deep into Elena's chest and refused to leave. Whatever happened next, she understood in that moment that she could not simply close the bedroom door and wait until morning. Whatever this creature was, wherever it had come from, it needed help now, and Elena was the only one there to give it. She reached slowly for the edge of the blanket on her bed, moving with the careful, deliberate slowness of someone approaching something that might bolt or might bite, and began to plan, in the dim light of a single flashlight, how she was going to save a dying wolf pup with nothing but a first aid kit meant for hiking scrapes, an internet connection too weak to load half a web page, and a determination that surprised her more than anything else that strange and unforgettable night. Elena did not sleep again that night, not for one single minute, and she would later think that this was the moment the old version of her, the one who planned everything and controlled everything, and never once let her life become unpredictable, quietly stepped aside and let a braver version take her place. She moved carefully, so as not to startle the pup further, and pulled a thick wool blanket from the foot of her bed. Then, kneeling on the cold floor with the flashlight propped against a shoe so it would stay angled toward the small trembling shape beneath the bed frame, she reached out one hand, palm open, fingers loose, the way she vaguely remembered from a documentary about wildlife rescue she had half-watched years earlier and never expected to need. The pup flinched at the movement, but did not snap at her, did not growl, did not do anything except press itself slightly further into the shadows, its breathing quick and shallow, its uninjured side rising and falling far too fast. Elena kept her hand there, unmoving, letting the animal understand that the hand was not a threat, that it was simply waiting. Minutes passed. She had no idea how many. Time out here in the dark, on her knees on an unfinished wooden floor, seemed to move differently than it had in her old life, where every hour had been scheduled and accounted for down to the minute. Eventually, the pup's breathing slowed just slightly, and its head, which had been pressed low against the floor, lifted a fraction of an inch, nose twitching toward her open palm. "Good," Elena whispered, barely more than a breath of sound. "That's it. I'm not going anywhere." She let another few minutes pass before she tried to move closer, and when she finally did, sliding her palm beneath the blanket to soften whatever contact came next, the pup made a small sound, somewhere between a whimper and a growl, but it did not lunge, did not bite, did not do anything but shiver, as her fingers finally brushed against damp, matted fur. It was thinner than it should have been, she could feel that immediately, ribs pressing close beneath the fur, in a way that told her this animal had not eaten properly in some time. The wound along its side was worse up close than it had looked from a distance, the skin torn and raw, though thankfully it did not look deep enough to have damaged anything beneath the surface. Still, an injury like this, left untreated, could easily turn dangerous within a day or two, especially for an animal this young and this weak. Working slowly, murmuring reassurances the entire time, Elena managed to work the blanket beneath the pup's body and gather it up against her chest. It weighed almost nothing, she realized with a small jolt of alarm, far less than she would have expected even for a young animal. It trembled violently in her arms, but it did not fight her, did not try to twist free, simply pressed its small head weakly against the fabric and let out one long, exhausted breath. She carried it out of the bedroom and down the narrow hallway to the living room, where the fireplace still held a faint glow of embers from earlier that evening. She knelt in front of it and added a few pieces of kindling, coaxing the fire back to life, and once a small steady flame was burning, she arranged the blanket into a nest, close enough to the warmth, to help but far enough away to avoid any danger of sparks. The pup settled into the makeshift bed with a shudder that seemed to run through its entire small body, and for a moment Elena simply knelt beside it, watching the rise and fall of its chest, terrified that each breath might be its last. She was not a veterinarian. She was not, in any meaningful sense, someone who knew the first thing about caring for a wild animal, let alone one as young and as fragile as this. But she had grown up around family pets, had nursed a childhood dog through a bad reaction to spoiled food once, and remembered enough basic first aid to know that the most urgent needs right now were warmth, hydration, and getting a proper look at that wound before it worsened. She retrieved her phone from the bedroom, saw with a sinking feeling that she had exactly 1 bar of signal, and used it anyway, searching with painstaking slowness for information on caring for injured wild animals, on wolf pups specifically, on anything that might tell her what to do in the hours before she could get real help. Pages loaded in fragments, images refused to appear at all, but she managed to piece together enough basic guidance to feel slightly less helpless. Keep the animal warm. Do not force feed anything heavy. Offer small amounts of water. Avoid handling the wound too much until it could be properly cleaned. And most importantly, whatever information she could scrape together seemed to agree. Get the animal to a wildlife professional as soon as possible, because young wild animals separated from their mother faced serious danger, even without an injury, complicating things further. Elena filled a small bowl with water and set it near the pup's nose, and after a long, hesitant moment, it lifted its head just enough to lap weakly at the surface, before letting its head drop back down onto the blanket, clearly exhausted by even that small effort. She found her first aid kit in one of the still unpacked boxes near the kitchen, and, working with hands that had steadied considerably since that first terrified moment on the bedroom floor, cleaned the edges of the wound as gently as she could manage, murmuring apologies every time the pup flinched or whimpered beneath her touch. It was not a professional job by any measure, but it was better than nothing, and by the time she finished, wrapping a strip of clean gauze loosely around the injured area, the pup seemed to have accepted, at least for the moment, that she was not a danger. She sat on the floor beside the fireplace for the rest of that long night, her back against the old stone hearth, watching the small gray shape breathe in and out, each breath slightly steadier than the last. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, exhaustion finally caught up with her despite the fear still humming beneath her ribs, and she drifted into a shallow, uneasy sleep, sitting upright on the hard floor, one hand resting lightly on the rise and fall of the pup's side, so that even in sleep she would know if something changed. She woke to gray morning light and the unfamiliar, wonderful sensation of a small, warm body pressed against her leg. The pup had shifted sometime in the night, moving from the blanket nest to curl against her, drawn perhaps by the warmth of her body, or simply by the comfort of not being entirely alone. Its eyes were open when she looked down, and though they were still clouded with pain and exhaustion, there was something more alert in them now than there had been the night before, something closer to awareness. "Well," Elena said softly, her voice rough from lack of sleep, "good morning to you too." The pup's ears, too large for its small head in a way that would have been comical under different circumstances, twitched at the sound of her voice, and for the first time since she had found it hiding beneath her bed, it did not flinch away from her. Elena knew, sitting there on the cold floor with a wild animal curled trustingly against her leg, that she had a decision to make. The sensible thing, the thing anyone with any real experience would have told her to do, was to call the local wildlife authorities immediately and let trained professionals take over from here. She had no business trying to nurse an injured wolf pup back to health on her own, in a house she barely knew how to live in herself, 40 minutes from the nearest real town. And yet, looking down at the small creature that had chosen, out of every hiding place in the world, to crawl beneath her bed on its worst night, and wait to see if she would help, Elena found she could not simply hand it off to a stranger's care, without first doing everything she could herself. She thought of Ruth's words from the diner counter, about keeping her porch light on, about curiosity being easier to handle than surprise, and wondered, not for the first time, whether the older woman had known something about this land, about the creatures that moved through it, that Elena herself was only beginning to understand. She thought too of Patricia mentioning a man named Daniel Cole, the forest ranger who checked in on cabins out this way, especially in winter, and decided that as soon as she had a stronger signal, or better yet, as soon as she could safely drive into town, she would find out how to reach him. A wild animal this young, this weak, likely needed medical attention beyond what her limited first aid kit could provide, and she was honest enough with herself to admit that she had no idea what the proper long-term plan even looked like for an animal like this. But not yet. Not this morning, with the pup finally resting peacefully for the first time since she had found it, its breathing steady, its small body finally warm. Whatever came next, whatever decisions had to be made about wildlife authorities, and proper care, and the impossible question of what happened to a wolf pup that had already bonded, even slightly, with a human being, all of that could wait until the fear in its eyes had faded a little more, until it trusted her enough to survive the stress of being moved again. Elena spent that entire day on the living room floor, leaving the pup's side only for the briefest necessary trips, to refill the water bowl, to add wood to the fire, to search her kitchen for anything soft enough and appropriate enough to offer as food. She found some plain cooked chicken in her refrigerator, left over from a meal 2 nights earlier, and shredded a small piece of it fine enough that the pup, after much hesitant sniffing, finally accepted a few bites directly from her fingers. Watching the small animal eat, watching the way its whole body seemed to relax by degrees with every passing hour of warmth and food and gentle company, Elena felt something shift inside her own chest as well, something that had been clenched tight for months, maybe longer, finally beginning to loosen. She had come to this cabin to heal herself, alone, in silence, away from anyone who needed anything from her. Instead, on her 4th night, life had handed her something small and broken, and utterly dependent on her care, and rather than resenting the intrusion, rather than feeling the old familiar exhaustion of being needed, Elena found herself feeling something closer to purpose than she had felt in years. By evening, the pup had grown strong enough to lift its head unassisted and hold it there, ears swiveling toward every small sound the old cabin made, amber eyes tracking Elena's movements around the room with obvious, growing trust. She sat cross-legged on the floor beside it, as the light outside faded once again into the deep blue of a Montana evening, and she found herself speaking to it the way she might have spoken to a friend, telling it about the divorce, about the job she had left behind, about the fear that had gripped her on her very first night in this cabin, and how strange it felt now, only days later, to be sitting here calm and steady, with a wild creature breathing softly beside her. "I think I'm going to call you Ash," she said finally, running one gentle finger along the top of its small gray head. "Because you look like you're made of ash and moonlight, and because I think we both survived something we weren't supposed to survive." The pup, as if it understood every word, let out a soft, huffing breath and pressed its head more firmly into her palm, and Elena Hartley, sitting on the floor of a cabin she had bought to escape her old life, realized with a quiet, startled kind of joy that she had not felt lonely once, not for a single moment, since the night she found a dying wolf pup hiding beneath her bed. Tomorrow, she promised herself, watching the fire crackle low and steady in the hearth. Tomorrow she would drive into Marrow Creek and find out everything she needed to know about keeping this small creature alive, about doing right by an animal that belonged, by every rule of nature, out there in the wild forest beyond her windows, rather than curled against her side in front of a dying fire. But tonight, just for tonight, she allowed herself to simply sit there in the quiet, listening to 2 heartbeats where the day before there had been only one, and to feel, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The engine of Elena's truck coughed twice before catching, and the sound made Ash flinch so hard against the passenger seat blanket that she nearly turned the whole trip around right then and there. It had taken her most of the morning to work up the courage to make this drive. Ash was stronger now, 3 days after she had found him beneath her bed, strong enough to stand on his own for short periods, and strong enough to whimper with real complaint whenever she left the room for too long. But the wound along his side, despite her careful cleaning, had begun to look slightly inflamed at the edges, and Elena knew enough to understand that this was beyond what she could safely manage alone in a cabin with no proper medical supplies. So she had wrapped him carefully in the same wool blanket he had claimed as his own, settled him into a cardboard box lined with an old towel on the passenger seat of her truck, and started the 40-minute drive into Marrow Creek with her jaw clenched tight and her eyes flicking constantly to the small trembling shape beside her. The general store, she had learned from Ruth at the diner, kept a bulletin board near the entrance with contact information for half the county, including, as it turned out, a wildlife veterinarian named Grace Lindquist, who ran a small clinic on the far side of town, the only one for nearly 2 hours in any direction, that had proper facilities and licensing to treat wild animals. Elena had called ahead using the payphone outside the general store, her own cell signal still too unreliable to trust for something this important, and Grace had told her, in a brisk, no-nonsense voice that immediately put Elena somewhat at ease, to bring the animal straight in. The clinic itself was smaller than Elena expected, a converted house with a modest waiting room and the unmistakable clean, sharp smell of antiseptic hanging in the air. Grace Lindquist turned out to be a tall woman in her 50s, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a practical braid, and forearms that spoke of years spent handling animals far larger and far more dangerous than a wolf pup. She took one look into the cardboard box Elena carried in and let out a low whistle. "Well now," she said, crouching down to get a better look without reaching in immediately. "Isn't this something? Where exactly did you find him?" Elena explained, the whole strange story tumbling out faster than she intended. The sound in the night, the amber eyes beneath her bed, the wound along his side that she had done her best to clean, but clearly was not enough. Grace listened without interrupting, her expert eyes moving over Ash the entire time, cataloging details Elena herself would never have thought to notice. "You did the right thing bringing him in," Grace said once Elena finished. "And honestly, the fact that he's alive at all after whatever happened to him says something about the both of you. But I need to be straight with you about a few things before we go any further." She lifted Ash gently from the box, and Elena watched her hands move with practiced confidence over the wound, pressing gently here, checking there, murmuring low reassurances to the pup the entire time, in a tone not unlike the one Elena had used herself over the past 3 days. "This is a young wolf," Grace continued as she worked. "Not a coyote, not a hybrid, not a large domestic dog that got loose. A wolf. Based on his size and development, I'd guess he's somewhere around 8 to 9 weeks old, which means he should still be with his mother and his litter, not alone and injured miles from any known den site that I'm aware of." Elena felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. "Do you know what could have happened to the rest of them?" Grace's expression tightened slightly, and for a moment she did not answer, focusing instead on cleaning the wound with careful, practiced motions, while Ash whimpered softly but did not fight her. "Could be any number of things," she said finally. "Territorial dispute with another pack, a predator attack, though frankly not many things around here would take on an entire wolf pack. Could have been separated during a storm, gotten lost, gotten hurt trying to find his way back." She paused, and something in the pause made Elena lean forward slightly. "Or," Grace continued, her voice dropping lower, "it could have been people." "We've had reports the last few months of traps being set out past the ridgeline, well outside any legal boundary, and a couple of incidents that never got fully explained. I'm not saying that's what happened here. I'm saying it's not impossible, and it's something worth keeping in mind if you're planning to keep living way out where you are." Elena's stomach tightened at the thought, but before she could ask anything further, Grace straightened up, having finished cleaning and properly dressing the wound, and gave Elena a long, appraising look that felt like it was measuring far more than just her ability to care for an injured animal. "Here's the thing you need to understand," Grace said. "Wolves are not meant to bond with people. It happens sometimes, especially with pups this young who imprint easily. But every professional in this field will tell you the same thing. The kindest thing you can do for a wild animal is to keep as much distance as possible and get it back to its own kind as soon as it's able to survive there. The longer he stays comfortable around humans, the harder that transition becomes, and the more dangerous it becomes for him, because a wolf that isn't afraid of people is a wolf that's likely to get shot by someone who doesn't know any better, or hit by a car wandering too close to a road, or worse." Elena felt something in her chest sink at the words, though she had known, somewhere beneath the surface, that this conversation was coming. "So what happens now?" "For now," Grace said, "he needs to stay somewhere warm and quiet, while that wound heals properly. And honestly, given how weak he still is, moving him to an unfamiliar rescue facility right this moment could do more harm than good. I'd rather see him stabilize a bit more first. I can give you supplies, proper wound care instructions, a feeding schedule that will actually meet his nutritional needs instead of leftover chicken." She paused, studying Elena carefully. "But I want you to understand, and I mean really understand, that this is temporary. Once he's strong enough, he needs to go to a proper wildlife rehabilitation facility that specializes in preparing animals like him for release back into the wild, minimizing human contact, teaching him the skills he'd normally learn from his mother and his pack. The nearest one I know of is about 3 hours from here, run by a group I trust completely. I'll make the call and get things moving, but it'll take some time to arrange, and in the meantime, the most important thing you can do is limit how attached he becomes to you. Less handling than feels natural, less talking to him. Let him stay a wild thing, not a pet." Elena nodded, though even as she agreed, Some small, stubborn part of her mind was already rebelling against the idea. She thought of Ash's small, warm body curled against her leg that first morning, of the way his ears had turned toward the sound of her voice with obvious recognition, of the trust that had grown between them in only a handful of days. The idea of deliberately pulling back from that, of teaching herself to be cold and distant with a creature that had chosen her, out of everywhere in the world, to crawl toward when it was dying, felt almost impossible. But she said nothing of this to Grace, only nodded, and accepted the bag of supplies and printed instructions the veterinarian handed her, along with a business card for the rehabilitation facility, and a promise that Grace would call ahead to start the process. As Elena carried the box carefully back out to her truck, Ash's head poking weakly above the towel to watch the unfamiliar world pass by, she nearly collided with a tall man in a green uniform jacket coming through the clinic door. "Sorry," she said quickly, adjusting her grip on the box. "No harm done," the man answered, and then his eyes dropped to the box in her arms and widened slightly with recognition. "Is that a wolf pup?" Elena hesitated, unsure how much to explain to a stranger, but something about the man's obvious concern, professional rather than merely curious, made her decide to answer honestly. "I found him under my bed, actually. He was hurt. I've had him at Grace's getting checked out." The man's expression shifted into something more focused. "I'm Daniel Cole," he said, extending a hand. "Forest ranger for this district. Mind if I ask exactly where you found him?" Elena introduced herself and gave him the general location of her cabin, watching as his expression grew progressively more serious with every detail she offered. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, clearly turning something over in his mind. "That's not far from an area we've had some concerns about lately," he said finally. "Nothing I can say for certain yet, but there have been reports of activity out past your property line that doesn't sit right with me. Illegal trapping, maybe worse. If you're willing, I'd like to come out and take a look around your property sometime soon, just to be safe." Elena felt that same cold chill from earlier return, stronger this time. "Of course," she said. "Anytime." Daniel nodded, and something in his steady, serious expression told Elena that this was not simply routine caution on his part. Whatever had happened to separate this pup from his pack, whatever had left him injured and alone deep enough in the forest to somehow find his way to her cabin, Daniel Cole clearly believed there was more to the story than a simple accident of nature. And standing there in the parking lot of a small-town veterinary clinic, with a wounded wolf pup cradled in her arms, Elena Hartley found herself wondering, for the first time, whether the danger that had brought Ash to her doorstep might still be out there, somewhere in the vast, dark forest surrounding her new home, waiting. Headlights swept across the trees at the edge of Elena's property just after midnight, and she was on her feet and at the window before she had even fully registered the sound of an engine. It had been 4 days since her visit to Grace's clinic, 4 days since Daniel Cole had promised to come inspect her property, and though he had not yet made it out due to what he called a busy stretch managing a controlled burn on the far side of the district, his warning had settled into Elena's chest and refused to leave. Every unfamiliar sound now made her pulse spike. Every set of headlights on the gravel road below her cabin, rare as they were, sent her hurrying to check that the doors were locked. This time, though, the headlights did not belong to a passing vehicle on the main road. They swung directly up her own driveway, cutting through the darkness in long, sweeping arcs, before settling into a steady beam pointed toward her cabin. Elena's heart climbed into her throat. Behind her, in the makeshift pen she had built in the corner of the living room out of an old baby gate borrowed from Ruth at the diner, Ash let out a low, uncertain whine, his ears pinned back, his small body pressed low to the floor. She crossed to the door but did not open it, instead peering through the narrow window beside the frame, watching as a truck she did not recognize rolled to a stop at the edge of her yard. A man climbed out, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy jacket despite the mild evening, and stood for a long moment simply looking up at her cabin, not approaching, not calling out, just looking. Elena's hand found the phone on the small table by the door, though she already knew, with a sinking feeling, that her signal out here was too weak to be relied upon in an emergency. She thought briefly of the shotgun that had come with the cabin, still locked in a case in the hall closet, untouched since she had moved in, a tool she had told herself she would never actually need. The man outside finally moved, walking a slow half-circle around the edge of her porch light's reach, his gaze sweeping across the tree line rather than the house itself. And something about his posture, deliberate, searching, made Elena's stomach twist with a fear that was different from simple startlement at an unexpected visitor. He was looking for something. Behind her, Ash's whine climbed into something closer to a soft, frightened growl, his nose lifted, testing the air that drifted in through the small gap beneath the front door. Elena hushed him instinctively, though her own pulse was hammering nearly as hard as his must have been. The man circled once more, paused near the edge of the trees, and crouched down to examine something on the ground that Elena could not see from her angle at the window. He stayed like that for almost a full minute, and in that minute, Elena's mind raced through every possibility: a lost hiker, a stranded traveler, someone entirely innocent who simply needed directions, and every possibility she considered was chased immediately by a colder, more insistent thought that refused to be reasoned away. Finally, the man stood, glanced once more toward the cabin, long enough that Elena instinctively stepped back from the window despite the darkness that should have hidden her from view, and returned to his truck. The engine started, headlights swung back around, and within moments the vehicle was retreating back down the gravel driveway, taillights shrinking into the darkness until they disappeared entirely around the bend. Elena stood frozen at the window for a long time after the sound of the engine had faded completely, her heart still racing, one hand pressed flat against her chest, as though she could physically hold her own pulse steady. Ash had gone quiet again, though he remained pressed low against the floor of his pen, ears still swiveling toward the door. She did not sleep that night. Instead, she sat on the living room floor beside Ash's pen, the shotgun case finally retrieved from the closet and set within reach, though she prayed she would never need to open it, watching the door and the windows in turns, until gray morning light finally began filtering through the curtains. The moment the sun was fully up, she drove into Marrow Creek and found Daniel Cole at the small ranger station near the edge of town, recounting the entire strange encounter, while he listened with a focus that made the fear coiled in her stomach tighten rather than ease. "Can you describe the truck?" he asked, and Elena did her best. An older model, dark-colored, mud splattered along the sides in a way that suggested it had been driven well off any paved road recently. Daniel was quiet for a moment, jaw tight, before he finally spoke. "There's a man named Roy Tanner who's been on our radar for a few months now," he said. "We've had complaints about illegal traps on land bordering the forest, a couple of reports of gunshots in areas that shouldn't have any legal hunting activity happening. Nothing we've been able to prove yet, but the description you're giving me lines up with what a couple other residents out that way have reported seeing." Elena felt the blood drain slightly from her face. "You think this Roy Tanner is the one who hurt Ash?" "I think," Daniel said carefully, "that it's possible, and I think it's worth taking seriously. Wolves in this area are protected, which means there's no legal hunting season for them, but that doesn't stop everyone from following the rules, especially folks who see wolves as competition for the elk and deer they'd rather have to themselves. If Tanner's been out there illegally, and if Ash's pack got caught in the middle of it somehow, that could explain both the injury and why he ended up separated and running until he found your cabin." The thought made Elena's stomach turn. "And you think he might come back?" "I don't know," Daniel admitted, which was somehow worse than if he had simply said yes. "But I'd feel a lot better if you let me, and maybe one other ranger, come stay out at your place for a night or two, just to see if anything else happens. And I'll be reaching out to the county sheriff's office as well, get an official report filed on both the trespassing and the possible connection to the wolf pup you're caring for." Elena agreed immediately, grateful beyond words that she was no longer facing this uncertainty entirely alone, and over the following 2 days, Daniel and a younger ranger named Owen Bradley took turns keeping watch near her property in the evenings, their trucks parked discreetly down near the tree line, where they would not be immediately visible from the driveway. Nothing happened on the first night. Elena barely slept anyway, jumping at every sound, checking on Ash constantly as though her vigilance alone could protect him from whatever threat still lingered somewhere out in the dark forest beyond her windows. It was on the second night, well past 11, that Owen's radio crackled to life with a report that made Elena's blood run cold even secondhand. Movement near the tree line, roughly 200 yards from the cabin, a single figure moving on foot rather than by vehicle this time, carrying something Owen could not fully identify from his position, but that looked, in the dim moonlight, distinctly like a rifle. Elena stayed low near Ash's pen, exactly as Daniel had instructed her to do in the event anything like this happened, one hand resting protectively over the small pup's back as his whole body trembled with an animal awareness of danger that needed no explanation, listening as radio chatter passed back and forth outside, in low, urgent tones she could barely make out through the walls. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Then, finally, Daniel's voice came through clearly enough for her to hear, tight with adrenaline but controlled. Subject is retreating on foot toward the ridgeline. We're not engaging. Repeat, not engaging, just tracking his direction for now. Elena did not fully exhale until nearly an hour later, when Daniel finally knocked on her door to update her in person, his expression grim but relieved. "We got a good look at him this time," he said. "Matches the description of Roy Tanner almost exactly. He was carrying a rifle, which on its own isn't illegal out here. Plenty of folks carry for protection, but combined with everything else, the trespassing, the earlier reports, the timing lining up with when Ash likely got separated from his pack, I think we've got enough now to bring him in for questioning at minimum." Elena felt something in her chest loosen slightly, though the fear that had settled into her bones over the past several days did not disappear entirely. "Do you think he was coming for Ash specifically?" Daniel's expression softened slightly at the question, and he glanced toward the pen in the corner of the living room, where Ash had finally curled up and fallen into an exhausted sleep, despite everything happening around him. "Honestly, I don't know for certain," he admitted. "Could be he was just checking his old trap lines, not expecting to find anyone living out here now. Could be word's gotten around town that you're caring for a wolf pup, and a man like Tanner might not take kindly to that, might see it as interference with whatever he considers his territory. Either way, I don't think you should be facing any more nights out here alone until we've got this sorted properly." Elena looked down at Ash's sleeping form, small and vulnerable, and utterly unaware of the danger that had circled so close to the both of them over the past several nights, and felt a fierce, protective resolve settle into place beside the fear, something steadier and more determined than she had felt in a very long time. Whatever had happened out there in the forest to separate this small creature from everything he had once known, whatever danger still lingered in the dark trees surrounding her new home, Elena Hartley was not going anywhere, and she was not letting anyone, man or beast, take Ash from her before he was ready. Sheriff Marion Blake arrived at the cabin 2 mornings later, a stocky woman with a steady voice and a notepad she filled with careful, deliberate handwriting, as Elena walked her through everything that had happened, from the first strange sound on her 4th night in the cabin to the 2 encounters with the unidentified man near the tree line. "We picked up Roy Tanner yesterday afternoon," Sheriff Blake said once Elena had finished recounting the events. "Found an illegal trap on his property, along with enough evidence to connect him to at least 3 other trap sites we've found, scattered through this section of forest over the past 2 months. He's denying everything about the wolf pack, of course, but between the traps and the trespassing charges we can prove, he won't be roaming around out here for a good while." Elena felt a wave of relief so strong her knees nearly buckled with it. "Do you think he's the reason Ash ended up separated from his pack?" The sheriff's expression turned thoughtful. "Can't say for certain, and honestly we may never know exactly what happened out there. But Ranger Cole tells me there was a confirmed pack sighting near the ridge, about 2 weeks back, right around the time frame that would line up with your pup showing up injured at your place. If Tanner's traps caught something, or if gunfire scattered the pack during a hunt he shouldn't have been running, that could easily explain both the injury and the separation. Either way, you did right by bringing this to us, and you did right by that animal in there." She nodded toward the corner of the living room, where Ash, now recovering steadily, had grown strong enough to stand on all 4 legs for extended periods, and had taken to following Elena's every movement around the cabin, with obvious, unwavering attention. After Sheriff Blake left, promising to keep Elena updated on the ongoing investigation, a strange, unfamiliar quiet settled over the cabin, the good kind of quiet. the kind Elena had originally moved out here searching for. For the first time in nearly a week, she did not feel the constant hum of watchfulness beneath her skin, did not flinch at every distant sound or every set of headlights on the road below. She spent that afternoon finally getting to properly enjoy Ash's continued recovery rather than simply managing crisis after crisis. He had grown noticeably in just the 2 weeks since she had found him, his legs longer, his coat thicker and glossier now that proper nutrition and rest had done their work. His wound healed to little more than a thin pink line beneath fur that had mostly grown back in. He had also, despite every warning Grace Lindquist had given her about limiting contact, become utterly and completely devoted to Elena's company. He followed her from room to room with the single-minded determination of a shadow, whimpering with obvious distress any time she stepped outside without him, and had taken to sleeping curled against her feet at the end of her bed each night, rather than in the pen she had originally built for him. Elena knew, with a growing sense of guilt she could not quite shake, that she had failed rather spectacularly at maintaining the professional distance Grace had recommended. But watching Ash tumble across the living room floor after a ball of yarn she had given him to play with, watching his ears perk with obvious delight whenever she returned from even the shortest trip outside, she found it nearly impossible to regret the closeness that had grown between them. Grace had called twice over the past week to check on his progress, and during the second call, her tone had carried a note of gentle but firm warning that Elena could not quite ignore. "He's healing beautifully, physically speaking," Grace had said, "but I need you to understand something important. The longer this goes on, the harder his eventual transition is going to be, both for him and for you. Wolves that imprint too heavily on humans often struggle to integrate with wild packs later, and in the worst cases, they can become genuinely dangerous once they're fully grown, not because they mean any harm, but because a 100-pound predator that has no fear of people and no proper wild instincts is a genuine liability, both to itself and to anyone it encounters." "I understand," Elena had said, though even as the words left her mouth, some stubborn part of her resisted fully accepting what they meant. The rehabilitation facility Grace had mentioned during that first visit had confirmed they had space available and were prepared to take Ash once he reached a certain weight and mobility benchmark that Grace estimated was still several weeks away. Elena told herself, repeatedly, that this was the right path forward, that no matter how much she had come to care for this small creature, his best chance at a full, healthy, genuinely wild life depended on minimizing exactly the kind of bond that had already formed between them. Knowing this intellectually, however, did nothing to prepare her for how it would actually feel. One afternoon, nearly 3 weeks after she had first found Ash beneath her bed, Elena took him outside for the first time, leashed with a makeshift harness Grace had recommended, determined to begin the slow process of reintroducing him to the natural world he would eventually need to rejoin. He had been outside briefly before, always closely supervised, always kept near the cabin, but this was the first time she had attempted to walk with him any real distance, out past the yard and toward the edge of the tree line, where the forest properly began. Ash's reaction to the wider world was immediate and profound. His ears swiveled constantly, tracking every sound, every rustle of leaves, every distant bird call. His nose worked overtime, drawing in scents that clearly told him stories Elena could never hope to understand. He strained gently against the harness, not with fear, but with an eagerness that looked almost like recognition, as though some deep, instinctive part of him understood exactly what this environment was and where he belonged within it. Elena let him explore as far as the harness allowed, watching him nose through fallen leaves and paw curiously at a rotting log, and felt a strange, bittersweet ache settle into her chest. This, she realized, watching him come fully alive in a way she had never quite seen inside the walls of her cabin, was who Ash truly was. Not a pet curled at the foot of her bed, however much comfort that image brought her, but a wild creature built for exactly this world of trees and scent trails and open sky. She thought of Grace's warnings, of the rehabilitation facility waiting to take him once he was ready, and felt the weight of an approaching goodbye settle over her more heavily than it ever had before. As the sun began sinking lower behind the ridge, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and purple, Elena led Ash back toward the cabin, his small body tired but clearly satisfied after the exploration, and settled onto the porch steps to watch the last of the daylight fade. Ash curled against her side immediately, his head resting on her knee, and for a long while, neither of them moved, simply existing together in the quiet, golden hush of early evening. It was in that stillness that Elena first heard it. Distant, carried on the evening air from somewhere far up the ridge, a long, mournful howl that rose and fell in a pattern unlike anything she had heard before, followed a moment later by a second voice joining the first, and then a third. Ash went utterly rigid beside her, his whole body suddenly alert, ears pricked forward, a low sound building in his throat that was not quite a whine and not quite anything Elena had heard from him before. She held perfectly still, one hand resting gently on his back, and listened as the distant howls continued, weaving together into a sound that was both beautiful and unsettling, ancient and wild, and utterly foreign to the quiet domestic life she had been building with this small creature over the past several weeks. Somewhere out there, in the vast dark forest surrounding her cabin, a wolf pack was calling, and Elena Hartley understood, with a certainty that settled deep and heavy into her chest, that whatever pack those voices belonged to, whether Ash's original family or another entirely, the day was coming, faster than she was ready for, when her small gray shadow would answer that call and disappear back into the wild world he had always truly belonged to. Smoke woke Elena before the alarm on her phone had the chance to. She sat up coughing, the acrid smell already thick enough in the bedroom to sting her eyes, and for one disoriented moment, could not understand what was happening. Then she saw the strange orange glow pressing against the curtains, far too bright and far too early for sunrise, and her stomach dropped as understanding crashed over her all at once. Fire. Ash was already awake, standing rigid at the foot of the bed, a low, continuous whine building in his throat as his nose worked frantically at air that had turned thick and wrong. Elena threw back the covers and was at the window in seconds, pulling the curtain aside to reveal a sky that should have been dark, with pre-dawn stillness, but instead glowed with a deep, unnatural orange along the ridgeline to the north, thick columns of smoke rising and billowing against the stars. Her phone, when she grabbed it with shaking hands, showed a single emergency alert that had somehow managed to push through, despite her usually unreliable signal, warning of a lightning-caused wildfire, spreading rapidly through dry timber along the northern ridge, advising residents in the surrounding area to prepare for possible evacuation. Elena did not wait for a second warning. She dressed in seconds, threw open drawers and grabbed whatever felt essential, important documents, a change of clothes, the small emergency bag she had assembled weeks earlier, and then largely forgotten about, and all the while, Ash paced anxious circles around her legs, his distress mounting with every passing moment, as the smell of smoke grew steadily stronger, even inside the cabin walls. Her phone rang just as she was loading the last bag into her truck, Daniel's name flashing on the screen despite the weak connection. "Fire's moving fast," he said without preamble, his voice tight with the particular controlled urgency of someone trained for exactly this kind of crisis. "Wind's pushing it southeast, which puts your property directly in the potential path if it keeps building the way it's building. I need you to evacuate now, not in 20 minutes, now. Head toward town, and if you see flames anywhere near the road, do not try to push through. Turn around and find another route." "I'm already loading the truck," Elena said, her voice steadier than she felt. "What about the wildlife out here? What about the pack?" Daniel was quiet for half a beat too long before answering. "Wild animals generally know how to move away from fire faster than we do," he said. "Their instincts are built for exactly this kind of danger, in a way ours simply aren't. Your focus needs to be getting yourself and that pup somewhere safe. Can you do that?" "Yes," Elena said, though her eyes were already on Ash, who had abandoned his anxious pacing and now stood frozen near the porch steps, nose lifted, body angled toward the tree line, as though something out there had captured his complete attention. She hung up and hurried to gather him, but as she reached for the harness she had left by the door, Ash suddenly bolted a few steps toward the trees, stopping just short of the yard's edge, looking back at her, with an urgency in his amber eyes that made her chest tighten with sudden fear. "Ash, no," she called, but he did not come immediately. instead pacing at the tree line, whining, glancing between her and the darkness of the forest beyond, in a way that seemed almost deliberate, almost like he was trying to tell her something. It was only when she finally caught up to him, harness in hand, that she understood. Faint but unmistakable, carried on smoke-thick air, came the sound of movement in the underbrush not far from where Ash stood, quick and panicked, followed a moment later by a chorus of distant howls, shorter and more frantic than the mournful calls she had heard days earlier, the unmistakable sound of a wild pack scattering in the face of approaching danger. Elena's stomach clenched as she clipped the harness onto Ash's squirming body and half-carried, half-guided him back toward the truck, glancing over her shoulder repeatedly toward the tree line, toward the sounds of a family, possibly his family, fleeing through darkness and smoke toward safety she could not guarantee they would find. She had no time to dwell on it. Within minutes she was pulling out of her driveway, Ash secured in the passenger seat with the same cardboard box he had traveled to the vet in weeks earlier, his small body trembling, but his eyes fixed steadily forward, and the gravel road ahead lit by a sky that grew more orange and more menacing with every passing minute. The drive into Marrow Creek felt longer than any drive Elena had ever taken, smoke thickening around her truck, until visibility narrowed to little more than the reach of her headlights, ash beginning to drift down through the beams like strange, dark snow. Twice she passed other vehicles heading the same direction, other residents from cabins scattered through the district fleeing the same encroaching threat, and each time the sight of another set of headlights brought a small measure of comfort in the midst of the fear. By the time she reached the edge of town, where an emergency shelter had already been hastily organized in the community center near the general store, the eastern sky had begun to lighten with true dawn, though the orange glow along the northern ridge remained bright and terrible against the retreating darkness. Ruth found her almost immediately amid the small crowd of evacuated residents gathering in the community center parking lot, wrapping Elena in a fierce hug the moment she spotted her. "Thank goodness," Ruth said, pulling back to look Elena over as though checking for injury. "We were all worried about you out there, being newest to the area and all. Is that the wolf pup everyone's been talking about?" Elena managed a shaky laugh despite everything, glancing down at Ash, who peered out from his box with wide, uncertain eyes at the unfamiliar crowd of people and vehicles surrounding them. "That's him," she said. "That's Ash." Over the following hours, word filtered through the gathered crowd via radio updates, and the occasional exhausted firefighter passing through for supplies. The fire, sparked by a dry lightning strike overnight, had grown quickly in the drought-stricken timber along the ridge, but had, thankfully, begun responding to the combined efforts of ground crews and an air tanker that had arrived shortly after sunrise. By mid-afternoon, the immediate threat to the residential properties along Elena's stretch of road had eased considerably, with containment lines holding steady against the worst of the advance. It was nearly evening before Daniel finally found Elena among the crowd, exhaustion etched into every line of his face, his uniform streaked with soot and sweat from hours spent helping coordinate the evacuation and containment efforts. "Your place is fine," he told her without preamble, sensing exactly what she needed to hear first. "Fire never got within half a mile of your property line. Should be safe to head back home in the morning, once the all-clear comes through officially." Relief washed through Elena so completely that her knees nearly buckled, and she reached down instinctively to steady herself against Ash's box, finding him watching her with the same unwavering attention he always gave her in moments of stress. "And the wild pack?" she asked quietly, thinking of the frantic sounds of movement she had heard near the tree line just before fleeing. "Do you know anything about them?" Daniel's expression softened, though it carried a note of honest uncertainty. "Can't say for sure," he admitted. "Wolves are smart, and they're fast, and their instincts for danger like this are far better tuned than ours. My best guess is they moved well clear of the fire zone hours before we even got the first alert, but I won't lie to you and say I know that for certain." Elena nodded, accepting the uncertainty because there was nothing else to be done with it, and spent that night, along with dozens of other displaced residents, sleeping on a cot in the community center, with Ash curled tightly against her side, his presence the one steady, familiar comfort in an otherwise upended world. It was not until 2 days later, once the fire had been fully contained and residents were finally cleared to return to their homes, that Elena drove back up the gravel road toward her cabin, half expecting to find the surrounding forest scorched and silent. Instead, she found the trees standing tall and green, exactly as she had left them, the cabin untouched. The only evidence of the crisis, a faint lingering smell of smoke carried on the wind from the blackened ridge miles to the north. That evening, as she sat once again on the porch steps with Ash curled against her side, watching the sun set in colors that seemed somehow more vivid after the fear of the past 2 days, the distant howls returned, rising from somewhere along the tree line closer than they had ever sounded before. This time, all of them, at least 5 distinct voices weaving together in the gathering dusk, unmistakably close, unmistakably alive, unmistakably safe. Ash's whole body went taut beside her, a sound building in his throat that was no longer uncertain or afraid, but something closer to recognition, closer to longing, and Elena understood, watching him strain gently toward the sound of his own kind calling through the darkening trees, that the fire that had threatened to take everything from her had instead, in its strange and terrifying way, confirmed exactly what she needed to know. Ash's family, whoever and wherever they were, had survived the flames just as she and Ash had, and somewhere out there in the vast dark forest, they were waiting, calling, drawing steadily closer to the moment Elena had known was coming, since the very first night she found a dying wolf pup hiding beneath her bed. Grace Lindquist arrived at the cabin early the following week, her truck loaded with fencing materials, a stack of folded canvas, and an expression that told Elena a serious conversation was coming before a single word had been spoken. "I've been talking with the rehabilitation team," Grace said as she climbed out of the truck, "and after everything you've told me about the pack activity near your property, especially after the fire, we think there might be a better option than transporting Ash 3 hours away to an unfamiliar facility." Elena felt a cautious flicker of hope rise in her chest, quickly followed by wariness. "What kind of option?" "It's called a soft release," Grace explained, pulling a roll of heavy-gauge fencing from the truck bed. "Instead of releasing an animal cold into unfamiliar territory, we build a large acclimation enclosure right here, on land the animal is already familiar with, close enough to established wild pack activity that he can hear them, smell them, gradually re-establish contact at a pace that feels natural rather than forced. It gives him time to rebuild the instincts and behaviors he needs, hunting small prey, avoiding humans, recognizing pack signals, all while still having a safety net if something goes wrong." Elena looked out toward the tree line where, over the past several days, the distant howls had grown steadily more frequent, sometimes rising in the early evening, sometimes in the deep hours of the night, always drawing something restless and yearning out of Ash that Elena had learned to recognize and, however reluctantly, to respect. "That sounds like it could actually work," she said slowly. "What would it involve exactly?" Grace spent the better part of that afternoon explaining the process, while she and Elena worked together to construct a large enclosure at the edge of the property, backing up against the denser tree line where Ash would have natural cover, natural terrain, and, crucially, proximity to the pack that Grace's own observations suggested was likely his original family, or at minimum, a pack that would be willing to accept a young, healthy wolf into their territory. The enclosure itself was sizable, nearly half an acre, fenced securely enough to keep Ash contained while he continued strengthening, but designed with gaps low enough along one edge, near the deepest part of the tree cover, that would eventually be opened entirely once the rehabilitation team determined he was ready for full release. Over the following weeks, the daily rhythm of Elena's life shifted once again, this time centered around slowly, deliberately teaching Ash the skills he would need to survive without her. Grace visited twice a week, bringing live and semi-live prey in carefully controlled circumstances to help awaken Ash's natural hunting instincts, instincts that Elena watched emerge with a mixture of pride and quiet heartache as her small, playful companion began transforming, session by session, into something leaner, sharper, more purely wild. She learned, following Grace's careful instruction, to reduce her own physical contact with him significantly, to stop speaking to him in the soft, constant murmur she had grown accustomed to let long stretches of each day pass with Ash simply existing in his enclosure while she observed from a respectful distance rather than sitting beside him as she once had. It was, without question, the hardest part of the entire process, harder even than the fear of that first strange night, or the tension of Roy Tanner's threatening visits. There were evenings when Elena stood at the edge of the enclosure, watching Ash pace restlessly along the fence line nearest the deep forest, ears pricked toward distant howls that had grown near enough now to distinguish individual voices from one another, and felt an ache so profound it nearly stole her breath. He was thriving, growing stronger and more capable with every passing week, exactly as he should be, and every bit of that thriving carried her one step closer to the goodbye she had known was coming since the very beginning. It was during the 5th week of the acclimation process that the wild pack first made direct contact. Elena had been inside preparing dinner when Ash's usual evening restlessness shifted into something far more intense, a series of sharp, urgent barks, unlike any sound she had heard from him before. She hurried out to the porch and found him pressed against the far side of the enclosure fence, body rigid with excitement and nervous energy, staring fixedly into the tree line where, emerging slowly from the shadows between the pines, stood a large gray wolf, easily 3 times Ash's size, watching the enclosure with steady, assessing amber eyes that seemed, even from this distance, unnervingly familiar. Elena's breath caught. Grace, standing beside her having arrived for a scheduled visit only minutes earlier, put a gentle but firm hand on her arm. "Don't approach," she said quietly, "and don't call out to him. Let this happen on its own terms." The 2 wolves, one behind the fence, one free in the open forest, regarded each other for what felt like an eternity. Ash's tail, held in a position Grace later explained, indicated cautious, submissive curiosity rather than aggression, the larger wolf's posture steady and watchful, but not overtly threatening. Eventually, the larger wolf let out a low, huffing sound, turned, and melted back into the tree line as silently as it had appeared, leaving Ash pacing anxious circles at the fence, whining softly toward the empty space where the visitor had stood. That could be his mother, Grace said thoughtfully once the moment had passed. Or an older sibling, possibly even a pack leader, curious about the new scent carrying on the wind from your property. Whatever the relationship, that kind of calm, assessing visit is an excellent sign. It suggests the pack isn't hostile toward him, which gives us real reason to hope the eventual reintegration will go smoothly. Over the following 2 weeks, similar visits occurred with increasing frequency, sometimes a single wolf approaching the fence line at dusk, sometimes 2 or 3 together, always watching, always assessing, never approaching aggressively, gradually building a kind of cautious familiarity between the wild pack and the young wolf they seemed, more and more, to be considering one of their own. Elena watched each visit from the porch with a complicated tangle of emotions she found difficult to fully untangle even in her own mind. Pride, watching Ash grow stronger and more confidently wild with every passing week. Fear, small but persistent, that something might still go wrong in this delicate process of reintroduction. And beneath both of those, steady and constant, a grief she had not expected to feel this early, grief for a goodbye that had not yet arrived, but that grew more certain, more inevitable, with every visit from the watching pack beyond the fence. One evening, as the last golden light of sunset painted the enclosure and the tree line beyond it in deep amber tones, Elena found herself standing at the fence longer than usual, watching Ash watch the forest, and finally allowed herself to say aloud the thought she had been carrying silently for weeks. "You're going to leave soon," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And it's going to be the right thing, and it's still going to break my heart a little." Ash turned his head at the sound of her voice, ears swiveling toward her with the same attentive recognition he had always shown her, and for a moment, just a moment, he abandoned his watch of the tree line and pressed close against the fence nearest to where she stood, close enough that she could, breaking every rule Grace had carefully taught her, reach through the gap and rest her hand gently against the top of his head one last time. Whatever came next, whatever the coming weeks held in store for the both of them, Elena understood, standing there in the fading light with her hand resting on the head of the wolf who had once been a dying pup hiding beneath her bed, that she had given Ash exactly what he needed: warmth when he was cold, care when he was broken, and now, hardest of all, the courage to let him go. The knock at the door came just after 10 in the morning, sharp and unhurried, and something about its rhythm made the hair on the back of Elena's neck rise before she had even crossed the room to answer it. She was not expecting anyone. Grace's next visit was not scheduled until the following afternoon, and Daniel had mentioned nothing about stopping by. Still, she told herself it was likely nothing, perhaps a neighbor from farther down the valley, perhaps someone with car trouble on the gravel road, and opened the door without checking the window first. Roy Tanner stood on her porch. She recognized him immediately, though she had never seen his face up close before, only the distant, shadowed shape of him circling her property in the dark weeks earlier. Up close, he was older than she expected, weathered and lean, with pale eyes that moved past her almost immediately, tracking toward the enclosure visible at the edge of the yard, where Ash, sensing the tension the moment the truck had pulled into the driveway, had already retreated to the far corner of his enclosure, hackles raised, a low growl building steadily in his throat. Elena's heart slammed hard against her ribs, but she kept her voice as steady as she could manage. "Can I help you with something?" "That's the wolf," Tanner said, not really a question, his eyes still fixed on the enclosure. "Word around town says you've been keeping him out here for months now, feeding him, training him not to be afraid of people." Elena felt cold anger cut through her fear. "He's being rehabilitated for release back into the wild, under the supervision of licensed professionals," she said. "Which is more than I can say for whatever you were doing out past my property line the night your traps were confiscated." Something flickered across Tanner's expression, gone too quickly for Elena to fully read it, and he took a half-step closer to the porch railing that made every instinct in Elena's body scream at her to close the door and lock it. "That pack's been a problem for 2 years running," he said, his voice low and hard. "Taking elk that should have been mine to hunt, getting bold enough to come right up near the tree line at dusk. I lost my bail hearing over those traps, thanks to whatever you told the sheriff, and now here you are, raising up another one of them to grow big and bold and comfortable around people who won't know any better than to trust him." Elena's hand tightened on the edge of the door, her mind racing through every possible response, every possible action, while behind her, faintly, she could hear the low, steady rumble of Ash's growl continuing from the enclosure, and somewhere farther off, unmistakable even over the tension crackling on her porch, the first rising notes of a distant howl answered almost immediately by a second and a third. "I think you should leave," Elena said, her voice shaking slightly despite her best effort to keep it firm. "This is my property, and you're trespassing again, which I'm fairly certain violates whatever conditions came with your bail." For a long, terrible moment, Tanner did not move, his pale eyes flicking between Elena and the enclosure, something calculating and unreadable working behind his expression. Then, from somewhere down the gravel road, the distinct sound of an approaching engine reached them both, and a moment later, Daniel Cole's truck rounded the bend into view, having arrived, as Elena would later learn, on a routine check that turned out to be anything but routine timing. Tanner's jaw tightened at the sight of the Ranger truck, and without another word, he turned, descended the porch steps, and climbed back into his own vehicle, pulling away down the driveway just as Daniel's truck came to a stop beside it. Daniel was out of his truck and moving toward the porch before the dust had even settled, his expression tight with alarm. What did he want? Elena's legs finally gave out slightly, and she sank down onto the porch steps, adrenaline draining out of her all at once, and leaving her shaky and cold despite the warm morning sun. "He knows about Ash," she said. "He's angry about the traps, about losing his bail hearing. I don't know what he was planning, but I don't think it was anything good." Daniel's expression darkened further, and he immediately reached for the radio clipped to his shoulder, relaying Tanner's presence and the direction he had driven off in to the sheriff's office, while Elena sat trying to steady her breathing, watching the enclosure where Ash still paced anxiously along the fence line, his growl only now beginning to settle into something quieter. Within the hour, Sheriff Blake herself arrived, along with a deputy, and the resulting investigation, prompted by Tanner's clear violation of his bail conditions in trespassing onto Elena's property a second time, resulted in his bail being revoked entirely later that same afternoon, ensuring he would remain in custody until his case went to trial. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," Sheriff Blake told Elena as she prepared to leave. "But for what it's worth, this likely helps our case against him significantly. Showing a clear pattern of targeting you and the animal in your care isn't going to look good for him in front of a judge. Elena nodded, grateful but still shaken, and watched the sheriff's car disappear down the gravel road before finally allowing herself to walk slowly out to the enclosure, where Ash still waited, alert and watchful, near the fence closest to the house. "I'm okay," she told him softly, crouching down near the fence, though she kept the careful distance Grace had trained her to maintain. "We're both okay." Ash's ears flattened briefly, and he pressed his nose through a gap in the fence toward her, a small gesture of reassurance that Elena allowed herself, just this once, to answer with a gentle touch to his muzzle. That evening, as the adrenaline of the day's events finally began to fade, Grace called to check in, having heard the news secondhand from Daniel, and after listening to Elena recount the encounter, fell quiet for a long moment before speaking again. "You know," she said finally, "everything that's happened, the fire, this man showing up again, all of it, I think it's actually accelerated something we've been building toward for a while now. Ash's instincts have developed faster than we expected. The pack's been visiting steadily. I think, if the next check goes as well as I expect it to, we should start seriously discussing a release date within the next 2 to 3 weeks." Elena sat with the phone pressed to her ear, looking out through the window toward the enclosure, where Ash's shape was just barely visible in the gathering dusk, sitting alert and watchful near the fence line closest to the wild forest beyond, and felt the strange, familiar tangle of relief and heartbreak settle once again into her chest. After everything, after the fear of that first strange night, after the fire and the threats and the long, slow work of teaching a small, broken creature how to be wild again, the goodbye she had known was coming from the very beginning, was finally, truly, within sight. The morning of the release arrived gray and still, mist curling low over the valley, exactly as it had on Elena's very first morning in the cabin, all those months earlier, and she stood at her bedroom window, watching it lift slowly off the trees, feeling as though the whole world had somehow arranged itself to mirror the beginning of this journey on the day it was finally meant to end. Grace arrived just after 7, along with 2 members of the rehabilitation team Elena had spoken with several times by phone but never met in person, a quiet, capable man named Peter, and a younger woman named Lily who specialized, Elena had learned, specifically in wolf reintegration cases. Daniel arrived shortly after, having requested the morning off from his usual duties to be present, and even Ruth had driven out from town, insisting she would not miss this for anything, standing now near the edge of the yard with a thermos of coffee and an expression that suggested she was doing her best to hold back tears on Elena's behalf. Ash himself seemed to sense that today was different. He had grown restless before dawn, pacing his enclosure in long, steady loops, nose lifted constantly toward the tree line where, over the past several days, the pack's presence had become almost a fixture, 1 or more wolves visible near the fence at nearly every dusk and dawn now, their initial cautious assessment having settled, Grace assured her, into something that looked very much like acceptance. "The process is simple, in theory," Peter explained, as the small group gathered near the enclosure gate that opened directly into the deeper forest. "We open the gate, and we let him choose his own moment. Some animals go immediately. Others take hours, even days, working up the courage to leave a space that's become familiar and safe. Either way, the choice needs to be his." Elena nodded, though her chest felt tight enough that she was not entirely certain she could speak without her voice breaking. She had spent the better part of the previous evening sitting near the enclosure fence, farther back than she once would have, closer than Grace probably would have preferred, simply watching Ash and trying to memorize every detail, the particular gray and brown pattern of his coat, the way his ears tilted slightly when he was listening intently, the low, contented sound he sometimes made when the evening air carried scents he clearly found interesting. Now, standing at the gate with the small gathered crowd behind her, she found herself unable to look away from him as Peter reached for the latch. "Would you like to be the one to open it?" Grace asked quietly, stepping close to Elena's side. "Since you're the one who found him, the one who's brought him this far, seems right that it should be your hand on the gate, if you're willing." Elena's throat tightened, but she nodded, stepping forward on legs that felt strangely unsteady, and reached for the latch herself. Ash, sensing the movement, had gone very still on the other side of the fence, watching her with those amber eyes that had once stared up at her from beneath a bed frame, terrified and dying, and now looked back at her steady, strong, and achingly aware. "I love you," Elena whispered, so quietly she doubted anyone else heard it at all, and pulled the latch free, swinging the gate open wide. For a long moment, Ash did not move. He stood at the threshold between the enclosure that had been his safe, familiar world for months, and the vast open forest beyond, ears swiveling, nose working, one paw lifted slightly, as though testing the boundary before fully committing to crossing it. Then he turned his head back toward Elena. He crossed the small distance between them in a few quick steps, pressing his head firmly against her leg one final time, the same gesture of affection he had offered her countless times over the past months, and Elena sank to her knees without thinking, wrapping her arms around him one last time, burying her face briefly against his fur, while every carefully maintained boundary Grace had taught her dissolved completely in this single, unrepeatable moment. "Go on," she whispered against him, her voice finally breaking. "Go find your family. I'll be right here." Ash pulled back, looked at her for one long, searching moment that Elena would carry with her for the rest of her life, and then turned and walked, slowly at first, and then with gathering confidence, through the open gate and into the tree line beyond. He paused once more at the edge of the trees, glancing back one final time, and Elena raised a hand in a small, steady wave, refusing to let the tears now streaming freely down her face slow the motion. And then, with a grace and a wildness that belonged entirely to him and not to her, Ash turned and disappeared into the forest. The small gathered crowd remained quiet for a long moment afterward, the only sound the soft rustle of wind through the pines and, somewhere in the distance, the first rising notes of a howl that Elena could have sworn, though she would never be entirely certain, carried a note of welcome rather than mere territorial announcement. Ruth was the first to move, crossing the yard to wrap Elena in a tight, warm hug that said more than any words could have managed. Grace followed, offering a quiet, professional pride that nonetheless carried real warmth beneath it, assuring Elena that everything about the release had gone exactly as they hoped it would, textbook perfect, a testament to the care and patience she had shown throughout the entire process. Daniel lingered longest, standing beside Elena at the now empty enclosure gate as the others began gathering their equipment and preparing to leave. "You did an incredible thing," he said quietly. "Not many people would have had the patience, or the courage, honestly, to do what you did these past few months." Elena wiped her eyes, looking out at the tree line where Ash had disappeared, feeling the ache of loss settle deep and permanent into her chest, even as something steadier and more hopeful settled alongside it. "I didn't do it alone," she said. "I couldn't have." That much was true. Between Grace's expertise, Daniel's protection, Ruth's steady friendship, even Sheriff Blake's diligent work bringing Roy Tanner to justice, an entire small community had rallied around one frightened, injured pup, and the equally frightened, if far less injured, woman who had found him. Elena thought of the divorce, of the loneliness that had driven her out here in the first place, of how certain she had once been that healing meant retreating entirely into solitude, and understood now, standing at this empty enclosure with tears still drying on her cheeks, how wrong that certainty had been. She had come to this cabin seeking isolation, and had instead found something far more valuable, a community, a purpose, and a bond with a wild creature that had, in its own unexpected way, taught her more about trust and courage and letting go than any therapy session or well-meaning conversation with friends ever had. As the last of the small crowd finally departed, leaving her alone on the porch as the afternoon light began its slow slide toward evening, Elena sat down on the steps, exactly where she and Ash had spent so many quiet evenings together, listening to the forest, and allowed herself, for the first time since watching him disappear into the trees, to simply grieve the goodbye, while also, quietly, gratefully, honoring everything the past months had given her. Somewhere out there, in the vast wild forest that had once terrified her and now felt, in some strange way, like an extension of her own healing, Ash was finding his way home. And Elena Hartley, sitting alone, but no longer lonely, on the porch of the cabin she had once believed would be her solitary retreat, understood that she was finding her way home too. A shape moved at the edge of the tree line just as the sun began to set, and Elena's coffee mug froze halfway to her lips. It had been 4 months since the day she watched Ash walk into the forest and disappear from her daily life. 4 months of gradually rebuilding a routine that no longer included a small gray shadow following her from room to room, and though the ache of that goodbye had softened considerably with time, it had never entirely gone away, surfacing most often in exactly these quiet evening moments on the porch, when the light turned golden and the forest grew still. She had heard updates about the pack occasionally over those months, mostly through Grace, who continued monitoring the area as part of the rehabilitation program's follow-up protocols, and through Daniel, who made a point of stopping by every few weeks under the loose justification of checking on her property, but who Elena suspected, and appreciated, simply enjoyed the visits themselves at this point. The pack had been spotted several times moving through the territory surrounding her cabin, healthy, cohesive, its numbers seemingly stable, and on one memorable occasion, Grace had reported a visual confirmation of a young wolf matching Ash's markings, moving confidently among the group, clearly integrated, clearly thriving. Elena had cried with relief after that call, a different kind of tears than the ones she had shed the day of his release, tears that carried more gratitude than grief. Still, she had not seen him herself since that day, not directly, not close enough to be certain, and though she told herself repeatedly that this was exactly how it should be, that Ash's continued distance from human contact was the clearest possible sign of a successful reintegration, some small, stubborn part of her heart continued to hope for one more glimpse. Now, watching the shape at the tree line resolve slowly into the unmistakable form of a lone wolf, standing motionless at the edge of the clearing, watching her cabin with steady, patient attention, Elena set her coffee mug down with trembling hands and rose slowly from the porch steps. She did not call out, she did not move closer. She simply stood, still and quiet, watching the wolf watch her, searching the distance between them for some detail, some marking, some familiar tilt of the ears that might confirm what her heart was already insisting was true. The wolf held its position for a long moment, longer than idle curiosity would typically explain, before finally, slowly, sitting back on its haunches at the tree line, settling into a posture that looked, to Elena's admittedly biased eyes, remarkably like the way Ash used to sit beside her on this very porch during their quiet evenings together, watchful but relaxed, present but patient. Elena felt tears prick at her eyes, though she found herself smiling through them rather than breaking down entirely. "Hey there," she called softly across the clearing, her voice carrying easily in the still evening air. "I've missed you." The wolf's ears swiveled at the sound of her voice, and for one breathless moment, Elena was certain, absolutely certain, that this was Ash, grown taller and leaner and infinitely more capable than the small trembling pup she had found beneath her bed all those months ago, but unmistakably, impossibly the same creature who had chosen her, out of everywhere in the world, to help him survive his worst night. They remained like that for nearly 20 minutes, woman and wolf regarding each other across the quiet clearing, as the last light of evening faded slowly into the deep blue of Montana dusk, neither approaching, neither retreating, simply existing together across a distance that felt, in that particular golden moment, far smaller than it truly was. Eventually, as full darkness began settling over the valley, the wolf rose, stretched in a manner so familiar it made Elena's breath catch, and turned to melt back into the tree line, disappearing as silently as it had appeared. Elena stood alone on the porch for a long while afterward, smiling softly into the darkness, before finally heading inside for the night. That visit was not the last. Over the following months, as autumn deepened into a long Montana winter, and eventually gave way to the first tentative signs of spring, the lone wolf returned periodically, never approaching closer than the tree line, never staying longer than 20 or 30 minutes, but appearing often enough, consistently enough, that Elena eventually stopped questioning whether it was truly Ash, and simply accepted, with quiet, grateful certainty, that it was. She built a small habit around these visits, keeping the porch light on each evening exactly as Ruth had once advised her to do on her very first week in town, not out of fear anymore, but out of something closer to invitation, a small beacon in the dark forest, letting a wild creature that had once needed her know that the door, metaphorically at least, remained open. Her life in Marrow Creek settled, over that first full year, into a rhythm she had never quite managed to find in her old city existence. Mornings on the porch, watching mist rise off the valley. Afternoons spent volunteering occasionally at Grace's clinic, having discovered in herself an unexpected passion for wildlife care that she had never known existed before Ash crawled beneath her bed and changed the entire trajectory of her healing. Evenings with Ruth at the diner, or with Daniel, whose visits had gradually shifted from professional check-ins into something warmer, something Elena found herself looking forward to with a fluttering anticipation she had not felt in longer than she cared to admit. The cabin that had once felt, on that very first terrifying night, like a lonely and unfamiliar retreat from a broken life, had transformed, slowly and unmistakably, into something else entirely. A home. A place of genuine belonging. Built not despite the wildness surrounding it, but because of it. Because a dying wolf pup had crawled beneath her bed on her fourth night there, and taught her, in the months that followed, that healing did not require isolation, that the bravest thing she had ever done was not moving to this remote corner of Montana alone, but opening her heart fully to something wild and unpredictable, and letting it change her completely. On the anniversary of the night she first found Ash, Elena sat on her porch as the sun set in familiar shades of orange and gold, coffee in hand, watching the tree line with the quiet, patient hope that had become as much a part of her evening ritual as the coffee itself. And when the familiar gray shape finally emerged from the shadows between the pines, settling into its usual watchful position at the edge of the clearing, Elena smiled, raised her mug in a small, silent toast, and felt, with absolute and unshakable certainty, that she had found exactly the life she had been searching for all along, one built not on solitude, but on the unexpected, unforgettable bond between one broken woman and one dying wolf pup, both of them, in the end, finding their way home.